Welcome to PayPod, the show that features thought-provoking interviews with leaders and entrepreneurs in the payments and financial technology industries. From credit card processing to Bitcoin, we cover it all. So if you want to know what's happening right now in the payments industry, stay tuned. Now, here's your host, Scott Hawksworth.
Hey, how's it going, PayPod listeners? I'm your host, Scott Hawksworth, and I've got another great episode for you. This week, we're going to be talking about something that is really, really important to many businesses and the larger payments industry, and that is digital fraud prevention. And helping me explore this topic and sharing information about his company's unique and robust solutions to this is Don Bush, Vice President of Marketing at Kount. Don, welcome to the show.
Thanks. I appreciate being here.
To start us off, Don, can you give us just a brief overview of Kount? At a high level, what does your company do for businesses, merchants, acquiring banks, and payment service providers?
You bet, Scott. So it sounds simple, but it's incredibly complex. When somebody goes to make a payment or create an account or change an account, there's some things that happen that digitally we can look at that legitimize a transaction so that we can tell whether that is coming from a real customer, a real subscriber, a real member, and whether the transaction that they are involved in is actually legitimate. It's them doing the right things. Whether merchants know it or not, or listeners know it or not, merchants are 100% liable for any fraudulent activity on their sites. So if they have a fraudster come through and use stolen credit cards to steal things, they're liable for that. Not the consumer, not the bank, it's the merchant. And so what we do is actually protect the merchant from that type of activity. And we saved them last year billions and billions of dollars. So it seems to be doing something right.
Absolutely. And obviously, it's very, very important for businesses to be on top of that kind of thing. Before we go further, can you tell us just a little bit more about your career and how you ended up at Kount?
Sure. I've been in technology marketing my whole career, except for a small time when for about 5 years, I was the district sales manager out in the Midwest. I have since recovered from that and got back to marketing. But I've been a technology marketer with hardware, software. I came to Kount about 8 years ago from another hardware. This was a hardware vendor called Cradlepoint, and they do cellular routers, another fantastic technology.
Yeah.
And Kount was doing some great things, and I wanted to be involved. And about 8 years ago, they brought me on the team.
Boom. And that's the story. So we kind of were touching on this earlier. And today, we are talking about digital fraud prevention. And you did mention a little bit about why fraud prevention is so important. But, what can happen to businesses that don't stay proactive in their approach to it? Is it all just the bottom line affected, or are there other things that fraud prevention can help with?
Well, there are a number of things, Scott. First of all, if you're not staying up to date with what's happening and how to prevent things, the first thing is losses. Whether you sell digital goods or shippable goods, it doesn't really matter. Those losses tend to mount, and that doesn't look good for anybody. The second thing is if you are not managing your fraud well, your payment provider and even the card brands themselves can penalize you, fine you, and ultimately take away your opportunity to use that payment method on your site. So if you can imagine not being able to accept Visa, that would be deadly.
Yes.
Yeah, or PayPal, or somebody turns you off because you're too much of a risk for them. You're not managing your fraud well. And then ultimately as well is your brand takes a damage. Your brand is a complete customer experience from the time they get on your site to the time they receive their goods, whether they do it online or they pick up in store. That's a brand experience. And if it's not a good one, results from surveys show that, 2/3 of the time, those people don't come back.
Absolutely. And, I'm just reminded of any big story I've seen, news story where a company, whether it's they've had credit card numbers stolen or big fraud or anything like that. And those are the things that in a consumer's mind, that's the kind of thing that sticks out. And that's when the question is, do I go with this business or this other one? Maybe the one that you didn't read that story about or hear about that fraud or whatever, right?
I think you're right. It tends to stick with people when they hear that negative, and it's deadly for brands, for payment types. If somebody heard that one payment type had more fraud than another, consumers tend to shy away from that.
Absolutely. Now, digital fraud prevention is not easy. And I'm curious, what makes it so hard to fight the bad guys, so to speak, these days who want to defraud companies? And what advantages do those criminals have that folks like yourself at Kount and you guys have to try to stay ahead of?
We sometimes have this misview of what a fraudster looks like. There's some hacker in the back of a room somewhere and the lights are low. These guys are very, very sophisticated. They're very well organized. They're very well networked. They talk to each other. It's a complete community, and it is global. Their technology that they use is getting increasingly sophisticated. So that makes it very difficult. The other side of it that makes it really difficult is the difficulty in prosecuting. You've got to find them first. Then you've got to have jurisdiction. Which country are they in? Which state are they in? And to prosecute those criminals can be somewhat difficult. The other side of that, too, is these guys rarely work alone. You might have part of the gang in Vietnam, part of them in the Bahamas, part of them in Pakistan, part in Chicago, and part in London.
Right.
And they're all working together. And that makes it even more difficult to prosecute, to find, to bring to justice these folks. So they don't have much fear of being caught. They've got great technology, which all means it's pretty difficult for the good guys.
Right. Those are all challenges you're presented with in trying to prevent this fraud, right?
Like I said, it gets more and more intricate every day.
Now, Kount has patented machine learning technology that analyzes transactions to stop fraud and increase revenue. That's something that's actively fighting these fraudsters. Can you explain a bit more about what the machine learning technology is doing? And I know you have persona technology and boost technology. What are those? What's that all about?
So you bring up a really good point. In the past, fighting those fraudsters has been, well, we've got a tool and they build one to get around it. We create another tool and they build another one to get around it. And kind of been this back and forth. In the past decade or so, Kount has been one of the pioneers on machine learning. It's a division or a branch of artificial intelligence. So what you try and do is disrupt communications, disrupt when these guys try and transfer information, try and do bad things, and how can we intercept them online? And machine learning allows us to do that. It allows us to look at huge batches of data and look for anomalies and look for clusters and look for trends and look for things that show us risky behavior. So persona technology, we call it linking technology. I might go on a website and make a purchase. Kount's technology goes out across the globe and says, hey, have I seen Don's email address? Have I seen this credit card? Have I seen this device? Have I seen this IP address associated with shady behavior? And if I have, show me what those things are, and I'll put together a decision or a risk profile of that transaction. And then the merchant can sit here and say, I'm willing to take that risk or I'm not. With machine learning, that happens literally in milliseconds. So I can look at millions of transactions with billions of data points in milliseconds and get that back to the merchant so that they're not waiting for a yes or no on that transaction. Because you and I, as consumers, we don't like to wait. We don't want to wait for an answer. And so
right.
We've got to get that stuff back fast. The second part of that is we call persona technology unsupervised. It's part of the unsupervised machine learning branch. It does things differently with that data. Boost technology is more of the supervised machine learning. It runs through hundreds of different models from data that we've had over the past 10 years around the globe. And so it runs in both of those paths and gives us back some incredibly accurate data on whether that is, it really is Scott making that transaction, or it's somebody that has Scott's information that's trying to look like Scott doing that. And we can tell that with incredible accuracy.
Wow. And so basically, what I'm hearing is just lots of speed and some elements of, either managed or just automation and pulling from past information. This is the kind of stuff that really just allows you to stay ahead of these fraudsters and kind of close the gap rather than constantly chasing them, right?
You bet. When we look at what we try to do, as soon as you've got static information, let's say it's a credit card, that number on your credit card doesn't change, not until you get a new one. And so it's hard to keep that out of the hands of fraudsters. when you start looking at what data is static or doesn't change very often, an email address, a credit card number, your home address, those things are easy for fraudsters to steal and resell and use against you. But what's difficult for them to do is not allow others to see that, because they buy and sell, they pass it around. And so as we intercept those things, that's where things like machine learning makes a huge difference. It's a very dynamic approach to a static problem, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. Now, Kount helps a lot of businesses in different industries defend themselves against this fraud. I'm curious to know, what are some of the industries that you guys often work in? Are there industries that tend to need to be extra diligent because of greater risk for fraud, that kind of thing?
We work in, I'd say every industry, but that sounds a little trite. We work in most industries. If you're selling hard goods or shippable goods, the risk you have is the loss of cost of goods. So Staples, when they sell a computer, they tend to have a high cost of goods, and it's difficult for them to deal with much fraud because it's so expensive. They lose the merchandise, they lose the cost of goods, they lose the margin, they get penalized, and so it's a very high cost to them. Then you go over to people like digital goods. If I'm selling concert tickets, it's a digital good. It has some value to it, but it's just as bad to lose a concert ticket, because now I may have sold this to a fraudster and a fraudster resells it 3 or 4 times. People show up at the event and they've all bought fraudulent tickets.
Right.
So it really depends on their particular business, their tolerance for risk, how they do things. There's a set of diligence for everybody. And I don't think anybody should be nonchalant when it comes to fraud and what it does to you.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And, obviously your excellent tools is probably the best way to help a business protect themselves against fraud. But I'm curious if you have any advice or maybe best practices that some businesses can follow in general to be more protected against fraud.
Sure. I think there's things businesses can do today. They could do it right now. The first thing is, go look at your buying patterns from your customers. What is a normal customer in your business? Do they buy once a week, once a month, once a year? Do they buy this product with this product when they come to your store? Do they use a coupon when they come to your site? What is normal practices in your business? And I say that because if you don't know what a normal customer looks like, you don't know what an abnormal
right.
customer looks like. It's hard to spot fraud when you don't know what the normal activity should look like. So that's a very easy thing for most people to go look and do. Do they buy in the store hours of 8 to 5? Are you more global where you've got sales coming in all day? So that's one thing that they could look at. The second thing they could do is take a look at where they're getting things like chargebacks. Fraud causes chargebacks, which is in the vernacular sort of like a non-sufficient fund bounce check type of thing. Where are those coming from? Most companies can tell when they get their chargeback report, oh, I'm getting them from this product or this region, or things are coming in via mobile. And that gives them an idea of where they can go look. And then the last thing would be, and seems kind of obvious, but it doesn't happen very often. Go to your own website and buy something. Walk through the process that you're asking your customers to walk through and see where you might think fraudsters see weaknesses. Mm-hmm. Is the technology up to date? Are we asking for too much information? If I'm buying a digital good, why should I put in my home address? Those types of things that tend to give fraudsters hints and clues as to whether you're using the best technology or not.
I think that's some awesome advice right there. And yeah, I mean, especially that last thing you mentioned about going to your website and actually, walking through your cart or whatever it is. That's how any kind of security, you look at it and you look at the weaknesses. Anyone trying to, secure a concert venue, you'll have security teams kind of walk through and look at it. So that makes perfect sense to me.
That's a great analogy. It is. It's where do I see the weaknesses that I need to beef up?
So given that our audience is primarily payment professionals, many of them are probably wondering, how can they work with Kount? Can you talk to us just about some of your partnerships and how they're co-marketing Kount, or maybe using it as an example, like an ISO, a PayFac, or a payment gateway?
Certainly. I hesitate to list all of our partners because I'll forget some of them. But
Sure.
Many of them they've probably heard about Paymentech, Moneris, BlueSnap, Braintree, PayPal, Cayenne. I could go on and on and on. And hopefully I don't offend anybody by missing them. But these companies have already integrated Kount. So when you buy their service, you get Kount.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes it really, really easy. The other way is talk to somebody like Kount and say, how would we fit into the payment process? Some people use us before they go to an authorization. And if we say that it's fraudulent, they never go to an authorization. They don't go to that expense. They will do either further review on the transaction or they'll just decline it based on fraud. So there's lots of ways to work with it, whether they want to come direct with us, go through one of our partners. It's available and it's easy to use.
Wow. So there's just a lot of ways that someone could look at, okay, here is our system. Here's what we've got going on. And maybe Kount could fit in right here and really shore up our protection.
Yeah, and I hate to keep repeating this, but every business is different. There's nothing that's out of the box that I would feel confident with people just pulling something out of the box. Do you sell internationally? Do you use riskier channels like affiliate channels? Do you have a mobile app that hasn't been set up for fraud protection? What are some of those things that this particular business is looking for? And then we tailor that to each one and make sure that we mitigate their fraud optimally.
That makes sense to me that's the best way to go about it for sure. So I'm curious, Don, how is digital fraud evolving? I'm curious what kind of current trends you're seeing. And, now that it's been in place for some time in the US, how has EMV chip card technology and retail payments impacted the fraud landscape?
It's funny that we predicted these trends long before the 2015 deadline. And now we're coming up on 3 years after EMV.
Mm-hmm.
And it has come to pass exactly like we predicted. As different countries have instituted EMV or chip and PIN as it's come to be known,
mm-hmm.
fraudsters stop counterfeiting credit cards and going to POS in store, and they just change their tactics to go online. So we've seen a rise in fraud movement online, which was expected. We've also seen, if you will, an upgrade in the criminal gangs that have come online. These folks that used to have counterfeiting networks around the world, now they've taken their efforts and moved them online. So it's not surprising to us to see 20, 30, 40% rises in online fraud and online crime that way. I think some of the industry or the trends that we're seeing are that sophistication has stepped up.
Mm-hmm.
We see, just like you or I, we're professionals in what we do. I have newsletters that I read about marketing, and I look at those for tips and advice and new technology. These fraudsters have those. They've got newsletters that sell their products, sell their advice, sell training. They've got videos on YouTube and Facebook. It's not hard to find them. They're in their 4th and 5th and 6th generation of some of the tools that they've created. They've even got services that you can rent. Fraud as a service, sort of like a SaaS software company for fraudsters. So the barrier to entry is very, very low. You mentioned that data is available with data breaches. Data
mm-hmm.
breaches are here to stay. They're not going away. That trend's not going to slow. And so there's cheap, good quality data on the market for these folks to use. So in all corners, they've got some really good things going on for them. And we see that trend as they continue to evolve their technology and their networking and their sophistication. We just see that continuing to grow over the years. And if people aren't being vigilant, they're going to be victims.
Right, absolutely. And it's almost like it's this back and forth where both sides, both folks on your side and then these fraudsters, they're just going to constantly be pushing each other and trying to stay ahead of it because there's a change in the protections and the things like that, like we were talking about with the EMV chip card and all that. And then they're going to now change their tactics, and then you're going to have to change tactics and all that kind of stuff, right?
That's correct.
So, okay, can you peer into the crystal ball? Where do you see Kount in, say, 5 to 10 years? Are there any long-term projects you're working on or overall goals that you can share, things that might be coming down the pipeline that you think your customers might really benefit from and be excited about?
The first thing that I would think about is our collaboration. Fraud is not usually viewed as a competitive advantage in this market. I compare it to accounting. If a CPA comes out with a new way to do accounting that's better, faster, smarter, they don't look at that as a competitive advantage. They want their peers to know those things so everybody can take advantage of that. We look at fraud the same way, and that's why we've collaborated with, as I mentioned, some of those partners earlier, but collaborate with not only payment providers, but data providers, acquiring banks, issuing banks, and the merchant. So when the merchant, particularly to Kount, when they use us, they know that we've collaborated with everybody in the ecosystem, and we're all on their side trying to give them the best protection possible. So I think collaboration is one key that I see with Kount today and going on in the next 5 to 10 years as well. I think another thing that's on the market today, but it's early, it's young, and that is behavioral biometrics. And this is more than just a thumb scan or a face scan. Those are biometrics, which they've been defeated in a number of areas, but behavioral biometrics is more of your behavioral patterns. And I'll give you an example. Scott, when you pick up your phone, you may swipe your code in, you may punch your code in, you may not have a code at all. When you look for things, how do you scroll through your phone? How do you go to apps? What apps do you have downloaded? When you interact with the phone, do you hold it one way or another? All these things are behavioral to you specifically. And those behaviors can be as accurate as a fingerprint. And as we look at consumers' behavioral biometrics, I think those are going to be more telling to a merchant that this is a valid consumer, and very difficult for fraudsters to mimic because they try and mimic things in mass, not one at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And to mimic Don Bush's behavioral interaction with my device is really, really difficult. And I see that down the road and very effective.
Wow, that's really interesting. I never thought about something like that. So, okay, I've got my last question really is a segment that we like to end with where we do fast 5 questions, rapid fire. So are you ready?
Sure.
All right. Number 1, make a prediction about the future of payments that you expect may happen in the next 12 to 24 months.
I think we're still going to see an explosion of new payment types on the market. You know, we've had Venmo for a while. What an exciting payment method that is. It's nothing new as far as the back end, but it's new in how consumers interact with each other and with their payment institution. And I think we're going to see more of those here in the next 12 to 24 months.
Number 2, what's one cool piece of payment-related technology that you've come across recently that's maybe unrelated to your company that impressed you?
You know, this is really far out there. This is almost Star Wars-ish, but I saw last week a ring, and the ring had a chip inside of it that was also a mobile wallet. So instead of having to pull out my card or my phone, I'm wearing my ring. I tapped the POS thing. It takes my data and I leave. That type of simplicity, I think, is pretty cool. The security of it, they didn't write a whole bunch about that, but it was pretty easy and pretty cool to see how fast and easy that type of a wearable was made functional.
Absolutely. Number 3, in the next 5 years, most Americans will make a purchase with either Bitcoin, Apple Pay, Google Pay, or some other thing. Which one and why?
I don't think Bitcoin's going away for a while. I think it will become a little bit more commonplace. There's hundreds of other coin type things. I think you'll continue to see those coming out, but I think they're going to converge at some point. I would not put Apple Pay out of the mix. I think they're going to put a lot of money behind that because I think they want to own the consumer from inception to grave. Mm-hmm. And I think they want to be part of that. I mentioned Venmo. I think there's going to be other types like that as well, that the consumer experience is just so easy and so friendly. I think we'll see one of those maybe come up out of the ranks.
For sure. What's one piece of advice you have for someone considering the payments industry as a career?
So somebody looking at a career in the payments industry, I highly recommend it. It is so dynamic. It is so new. The technology is refreshing every day. Just look at what we were doing a couple of years ago, and then Apple Pay comes on the market, kind of changes the way we think about making payments. And that's going to continue to evolve. And in that industry are all the supporting industries like mine. Like, how do I protect that payment and make sure that that is a legitimate consumer that should be making this transaction and not a fraudster? The other thing is read. The innovation in this space is mind-boggling, and it's happening at a rapid pace. Make sure you're keeping up on that stuff.
My last question. What's the best business advice you've ever received, and from whom?
I received this from a boss several years ago when I was getting started in the technology market. He said, Don, technology is going to change. Pretty soon we'll be making calls from our watches and doing really cool stuff. But he said one thing doesn't change, and that's the integrity of business. If people know that they can do business with you because of your integrity, that doesn't change, and technology doesn't change that. And I've always looked at that as doesn't matter whether I'm interacting with somebody via text, on the phone, or in person, the integrity that I bring to the game makes the difference.
That's a great piece of advice and very important. Don, I wanted to thank you so much for joining me today. This was really informative and fascinating for me too. I mean, a lot of the stuff I hadn't really thought about, so thank you. So that's it for our interview today, which means that it is time to award our Small Business Organization of the Week. Each and every episode, we want to highlight business groups and organizations doing great work advancing the interests of entrepreneurs and small businesses, helping business people connect, being positive influences in their local communities, and so much more. These organizations are nominated by you, our listeners. So if you ever think of one you think deserves to be highlighted, don't hesitate to let us know. Send an email to scott@soarpay.com and we may just mention it. Now, this week we are so pleased to recognize the National Small Business Association, or NSBA. For more than 80 years, the NSBA has represented America's small business owners. The NSBA is a staunchly nonpartisan organization with 65,000 members in every state and every industry in the U.S. They are a volunteer-led association, and their primary mission is to advocate state and federal policies that are beneficial to small business, the state, and the nation, and promote the growth of free enterprise. Members of the NSBA benefit in a number of ways. Specifically, NSBA offers its members a myriad of resources and insight on legislative issues that impact America's small business owners. Through various partnerships, they offer discounts to members on a variety of products, including health insurance. So if you'd like to learn more about them or even join, you can find them online at nsba.biz. Many congrats are due to them for their selection. Well, that's it for our show today. Thank you so much for listening. And if you like what we do here, don't forget to rate and review us on iTunes or whatever your preferred podcast listening platform is. We'll be back with another episode very soon.
Thank you for listening to another episode of PayPod, brought to you by Soar Payments. Soar Payments is a leading merchant services provider for e-commerce, high-risk, and hard-to-place businesses. If you'd like to get the latest PayPod episode sent to you automatically, subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher, or visit soarpay.com/podcast.